Imagine stepping into a church, the sound of your footsteps echoing off the ancient stone walls. The air is thick with an unsettling silence, but something feels off. A whisper creeps from the shadows, as if the very walls are alive. You glance around, but there's no one there. Your pulse quickens. You take a step forward and freeze, etched into the pews. Strange symbols begin to glow faintly in the dim light. The altar is no longer a place of worship but a twisted shrine, and what lurks in the darkness has been waiting for you for far too long. This isn't a place for prayer. It's a place for something much darker. Welcome to the terrifying world of abandoned Appalachian churches, where faith turned into something horrifying. The line between salvation and damnation has long been crossed in these forgotten places. If you're ready to dive deeper into the eerie tales of these forsaken sanctuaries and uncover what twisted forces haunt them, hit that subscribe button on Whispers in the Dark. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling stories that will leave you questioning the line between the sacred and the sinister. Part 1. The Whispering Chapel of Black Hollow. Deep within the dark, coal-streaked heart of West Virginia lies a place that was once a sanctuary of peace and hope. Black Hollow Methodist Church, built in 1887 by a group of miners, was their refuge from the harsh realities of life deep underground. A place where they gathered to seek salvation, solace, and protection from the unforgiving world around them. For nearly 70 years, the church stood as a beacon of faith in an otherwise rugged, isolated landscape. But like so many others, the church was not meant to endure. When the mines dried up and the town of Black Hollow slowly withered away, the church was left to rot in solitude. It wasn't long before the faithful stopped coming, and the church was abandoned. Windows shattered, the roof began to cave in, and the scent of mildew and decay permeated the air. But unlike other forgotten buildings, this one did not fall into complete silence. Strangely, the whispers began. Hikers passing through the area started reporting something unsettling, a sound that couldn't be explained. Soft murmurs, whispers, like the building was trying to speak to them. Some swore they had heard faint voices, hushed conversations that would stop abruptly the moment they approached the door. The whispers weren't natural. They were too deliberate, too intentional, as if something, or someone, was lurking just beyond the edges of the church, waiting to be noticed. Local historian Elijah Thornton was the first to investigate the stories. He was no stranger to the eerie, the unexplained, and the strange happenings that often accompanied abandoned buildings in the Appalachian Mountains. But Black Hollow's church was different. He dug through parish records and discovered a chilling detail. In the 1960s, a splinter group had continued meeting in secret, even after the church had officially closed. They followed a man who claimed to speak to those beyond the veil, a self-proclaimed medium who led them in strange, midnight rituals. Thornton visited the church several times in his search for answers. Each time he was drawn deeper into the mystery. The pews, though covered in dust, were arranged in a way that was unusual, circular, facing inward instead of toward the pulpit. There was a sense of pressure in the air, as if the very space inside the church was alive, breathing with something dark. And then there was the floor. At first glance, it seemed perfectly normal, worn with age but otherwise intact. However, as the moonlight filtered through the broken roof, something became clear. The wooden planks had been meticulously removed in certain areas, leaving thin strips that formed an intricate pattern. The pattern was like nothing anyone had ever seen before, a symbol so ancient that no one in modern times could recognize its meaning. Some believed it was an old occult symbol, one that had been carved into the very heart of the church to mark the beginning of something much darker. The whispers, too, grew stronger as the years passed. Locals who ventured too close to the church began to feel an oppressive weight in the air. Some reported hearing the sounds of chanting, though the words were indecipherable. Others claimed to see flickers of shadowy figures through the cracked windows, moving in and out of the church as if the spirits of the past still roamed the halls. It became clear that Black Hollow Church was no longer a place of worship. It had become a vessel for something far older, far darker. The faith that had once filled its halls had been replaced by something sinister, something that had taken root in the very soil of Black Hollow, feeding off the isolation and desperation of the town's former residents. But what had truly happened in Black Hollow? What had the miners unknowingly unleashed when they built the church? And what had those strange rituals led to in the years after? These were questions that Thornton couldn't answer. All he could do was listen to the whispers and wait. As the moonlight touched the crumbling stones of Black Hollow, Elijah Thornton couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The whispers grew louder and the wind began to howl, carrying with it the faintest trace of a voice, low and guttural, as though it came from the depths of the earth itself. It was the voice of someone or something that had been waiting for him. The Black Hollow Methodist Church remains a chilling relic of a time gone by, its dark past hidden beneath layers of dust and decay. And while the town of Black Hollow has long been abandoned, the whispers in the chapel continue. They wait just out of reach, ready to be heard by those brave or foolish enough to listen. Part 2. St. Agnes of the Hollow Tree. In the remote valleys of eastern Kentucky, hidden within the ancient folds of the Appalachian Mountains, there stands a forgotten monument to both faith and mystery, St. Agnes Catholic Church. Built in 1912, this small, modest church once served as the heart of its community, a sanctuary where the people of the nearby hills would gather, seeking solace, prayer, and the hope that their lives would improve. It was, in the beginning, a place of peace. But as the years passed, it transformed into something unrecognizable, a place of dread that no longer echoed with hymns but with something far more sinister. The church's downfall began with the mysterious disappearance of its parish priest, Father Michael Connolly, in 1978. Father Connolly had been a beloved figure in the community, known for his calming presence and unwavering devotion to his flock. He had served as the spiritual guide for the people of St. Agnes for nearly 2 decades. But one fateful morning, without a trace or warning, he vanished. There were no signs of struggle, no note left behind, not even a hint of where he might have gone. The people of St. Agnes searched high and low, calling upon God and the heavens themselves to guide them, but their prayers went unanswered. Father Connolly was never seen again. With the priest gone, the church quickly lost its vibrancy. The pews, once filled with the devoted, became increasingly empty. The stained glass windows, which had once captured the light in a dazzling display of color, began to crack and fade. Slowly, but surely, the church was abandoned. The doors locked, and its sanctuary lay dormant, as though it had given up on its purpose. But something darker took root in the absence of light. By the time the church had officially ceased to hold services, something was already taking shape within its hollowed walls, something unnatural. It wasn't long before locals began to notice strange occurrences around the church. Those who dared approach would hear whispers, faint but persistent, drifting from inside the building. It was as though the voices of the past had taken on a life of their own, filling the empty air with an unnatural energy. And then came the tree. At first, it seemed like a mere curiosity. A large oak tree had begun to grow through the church's center, its trunk twisting upward where the altar had once stood. A botanical marvel, some would say. Yet there was an eerie, unnerving quality to the tree's growth. The way its roots seemed to claw into the very foundation of the church was unnatural. The tree, impossibly ancient, was far older than the church itself. Its massive trunk rose, not only through the floor but through the ceiling, stretching its gnarled branches toward the heavens. It wasn't just any tree. It had become something else, something that seemed tied to the land in ways that could not be easily explained. The tree became a symbol of the church's corruption, its darkening transformation. People who had once visited the church to pray now stayed far away, avoiding the place altogether. But the tree's sinister presence was not the only thing that set St. Agnes apart from the other abandoned buildings in the area. As the years went by, an even more unsettling phenomenon began to occur. Small, crude effigies started appearing on the branches of the oak tree, dolls fashioned from twigs, scraps of cloth, and what appeared to be human hair. The effigies grew in number over time, hanging from the branches like macabre ornaments. They were twisted, unsettling, and something about them seemed wrong. Some of the dolls were left with their heads tilted at unnatural angles, others with their faces carved into grotesque, distorted expressions. Attempts to remove these dolls were met with misfortune. In 1983, a sheriff, eager to rid the tree of its dark decorations, decided to cut them down. He never made it far. Within days, he began to suffer from a strange, wasting illness. No one could diagnose it, and it only grew worse as time went on. Within a month, the sheriff had passed, his body withering away as if all life had been drained from him. Some say it was the tree that did it, a dark force tied to the land, feeding off the souls of those who dared to challenge it. But it wasn't just adults who were affected. Children in the area started having strange dreams, dreams of a priest who stood by their beds at night, whispering secrets of old gods that slumbered deep beneath the mountains. The priest's voice, they said, was not comforting. It was not the voice of the father they had once known, but a low, guttural tone that carried with it an aura of danger. Children would wake in cold sweats, screaming about the man who visited them in their dreams, who spoke of forgotten deities and ancient rites. It was as though Father Connolly had not left at all. It was as though he had become something else, something far more powerful and dangerous. The people of St. Agnes spoke in hushed tones about what might have happened. Some said that Father Connolly had uncovered ancient knowledge in his search for faith, that the disappearance was not an accident but a voluntary sacrifice, a turning away from the righteous path in search of something darker. Perhaps he had been lured by the pull of an ancient power buried deep within the earth itself, something the church had unknowingly been built on. And so, the whispers continued. Those who dared venture close to St. Agnes began to report seeing strange shadows moving within the building at night, flickering like fireflies in the cracks of the church's windows. Others claimed they heard the distinct sound of chanting coming from inside, but when they tried to investigate, the sound stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against their ears. The once beautiful stained glass windows now seemed distorted when viewed from certain angles. The images they depicted, saints and angels, appeared twisted, their faces contorted in agony. Even the air around the church had changed. It felt heavier, more suffocating, as though something was holding its breath, waiting for someone, or something, to release it. As the years turned into decades, St. Agnes Catholic Church became a place of fear, a dark legend that the locals told in whispers and warnings. No one dared to approach it after sunset, and the oak tree grew ever more twisted, its branches stretching wider, its effigies multiplying. The name St. Agnes became a word spoken only in fear, a reminder of the evil that had taken root in the heart of Kentucky's mountains. Yet as the years passed, people still spoke of the church, still wondered about its curse. And perhaps in the back of their minds, there was always that question that lingered. Had Father Connolly truly disappeared, or had he simply become something else? Something waiting in the shadows, watching, listening, still speaking in the dead of night. The mystery of St. Agnes Catholic Church, like so many abandoned churches in Appalachia, would remain unsolved for decades. It stood as a monument to what faith could become when twisted and corrupted, a stark reminder that the line between worship and devotion to something far older and more terrifying was often razor-thin. And as the winds howled through the trees, carrying with them the whispers of the past, one truth remained. In the Appalachian Mountains, some churches never close. They simply wait. The eerie allure of St. Agnes continued to capture the imagination of all who had heard its story. And though the church stood abandoned, its curse was alive and well, forever part of the dark, tangled history of the Appalachian Mountains. Those who would come next would find themselves asking the same question. Would they, too, hear the whispers of old gods, waiting just beyond the veil? The years since Father Connolly's disappearance blurred into one long, relentless shroud of unease. The St. Agnes Church, once a peaceful sanctuary, now stood as a hollow shell of its former self. But there was a lingering presence, an undeniable weight in the air. People from surrounding communities would tell stories of the church at night, their voices trembling, as if even speaking its name brought a curse upon them. The oak tree had become more than just a botanical curiosity. Its roots had spread like veins deep into the earth, as though feeding on something far older than time itself. The once unassuming chapel now seemed like a dark altar to something far more ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries beneath the soil. As the tree's branches twisted higher, so too did the whispers in the wind, their guttural tones growing louder, clearer, and more insistent. Local legends spoke of the tree's origins, saying it wasn't a normal oak. It had been planted with dark intentions, its roots entwined with the very bones of the mountain. Some even said that it had absorbed the grief, despair, and madness of those who had worshipped there for generations. And now, the tree was alive, alive in a way that defied nature. Every year it grew more monstrous, its bark blackening, its leaves turning an unnatural shade of crimson that made the church look as though it were bleeding from within. But the real horror lay beneath the surface. One evening, as the full moon hung low in the sky, a curious hiker named Andrew stumbled upon the church, unaware of the dark history that had enveloped it. He had heard stories, but like most, he dismissed them as mere folklore, creepy tales meant to keep children away from the forest. But when he arrived, standing at the threshold of the decaying church, something inside him told him that there was more to this place than he could ever understand. The air was suffocatingly thick, heavy with an unseen presence that seemed to claw at the walls of the building. He stepped inside cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The inside of St. Agnes was colder than the night air outside, and as he walked further in, he noticed that the church's interior had a foul stench, one that smelled of decay and earth, as though the ground itself was rotting. The once pristine pews were now twisted and broken, their wood warped and splintered as though someone had tried to force them into shapes they weren't meant to take. As Andrew made his way toward the altar, his eyes were drawn to the oak tree, the great, ancient oak that now dominated the space. It stood tall, its roots sprawling like monstrous veins, and the sickly branches loomed over the altar. But it wasn't the tree that made Andrew's blood run cold, it was what lay beneath it. The earth around the tree had been disturbed, as though something had clawed its way to the surface. Upon closer inspection, Andrew saw the faint outline of a large, round hole, but there was something else. The soil inside the hole wasn't natural. It was a dull, grayish color, different from the dark, rich earth of the surrounding area. The more he stared at it, the more he felt an odd compulsion to step closer, as though the hole was calling to him. But before he could take another step, he heard it, the whisper. It was faint at first, like a soft rustle, but it grew louder, clearer, until Andrew could make out words, low, guttural words that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. "Come closer, you are wanted." His heart pounded in his chest. It was not just a voice, it was a presence. Something ancient, something hungry. The very air around him seemed to shift, the temperature dropping even further. He instinctively took a step back, but the whisper followed him, growing louder and more insistent, until it was as though the walls themselves were speaking. "Come closer. Join us in the darkness." Andrew's mind raced as panic set in. He turned to leave, but the church had changed. The exit, once clearly visible, now seemed distant and obscured, as if the building had expanded while he wasn't looking. His heart thudded in his chest as he ran toward the door, but the whispers grew louder, now accompanied by a sickening sound, scratching, like nails dragging across stone. The moment he stepped outside, the moonlight seemed to flicker, casting long, twisted shadows that writhed across the land like living things. He turned to see the oak tree, its branches now reaching toward him, as if trying to ensnare him. The whispers followed him, urging him to return, to stay. But Andrew didn't stop running. As he reached the edge of the forest, gasping for air, he dared one last look over his shoulder. The church was there, standing as it always had, but now it was different. It seemed to shimmer in the moonlight as though it was no longer a building at all, but something alive. The whispers, now a chorus, seemed to mock him, their voices echoing in the night. The oak tree swayed, its branches twisting like fingers reaching toward him, toward the mountain itself. The next morning, when authorities found him, Andrew was pale, trembling, and speechless. He could not remember the details of what happened inside the church. His mind, it seemed, had shattered under the weight of what he had experienced. All he could say, over and over, was, "It wanted me. It wanted me to stay." But Andrew wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last to encounter the horrors lurking in St. Agnes. Over the years, more reports came in of strange occurrences, of people who ventured into the mountains never to return, or who returned changed, haunted by the whispers, their minds broken by the things they saw. One woman, a journalist named Sarah, had visited St. Agnes in an attempt to uncover the truth behind the rumors. She brought a camera, hoping to capture evidence of the strange happenings. But her footage, when reviewed, revealed something far more disturbing than she had expected. As she filmed the church, the video showed a faint figure, something that looked like a man but not quite human. His face was obscured, but his eyes glowed a faint, unnatural green, and as he moved, he seemed to distort, flickering in and out of view like a shadow, too real and yet too unreal. Sarah disappeared 3 days later. Her camera was found, but her footage was all that remained. The last frame showed the figure reaching out toward her, his hand just inches from the camera lens before the screen went black. And still, St. Agnes stands, its doors locked, its windows darkened, but it is not abandoned. Not truly. The whispers, the eerie presence, the tree that has grown too large to ignore, they remain. The mountain itself seems to hold the church in its grip, unwilling to let it go. And though the building is empty, there are those who still hear the whispers on the wind, calling them home, beckoning them to enter the darkness. There are those who claim the tree is a doorway to something ancient, something that slumbers beneath the earth, waiting to be awakened. And there are others who say that the souls of the lost, those who have come before, still linger in the church, bound to the land, to the tree, to the whispers that never stop. In the mountains of Kentucky, Some places are better left untouched, and St. Agnes, with its oak tree and its whispers, is one of them. Now the legend of St. Agnes is something whispered about only in the darkest corners of the Appalachian hills, passed on like a warning. Some churches never truly close. They simply wait for the next soul foolish enough to step inside. St. Agnes of the Hollow Tree Part 3, The Forgotten Souls. The years passed, and the story of St. Agnes of the Cursed Oak Tree and its whispers became more than just a local legend. It grew in stature, taking on a life of its own, until it reached the ears of those in distant towns, cities, and even the farthest reaches of the state. But no one dared approach the forsaken church, for the whispers had begun to spread, not just in the immediate vicinity of the church, but to those who had never even set foot in the Appalachian Mountains. The first new arrival to the area was a young man named Marcus Hayes, a man whose curiosity was as dangerous as it was insatiable. Marcus had heard the rumors about St. Agnes, about the eerie oak tree and the inexplicable disappearances. At first, he'd scoffed, dismissing the tales as superstition or simply exaggerated stories meant to frighten the weak of heart. But soon, his skepticism faltered. There was something undeniably captivating about the church's history, a darkness that called to him, despite his better judgment. He arrived in Kentucky on a crisp autumn evening, the sky painted a deep orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was thick with mist, a haunting fog that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath his feet. The path to St. Agnes, though marked by a faded sign and barely visible dirt trail, seemed to pull him deeper into the forest. The trees around him stretched like twisted fingers, their branches clawing at the heavens above, and for a moment he thought he saw a faint light flicker in the distance, a fire perhaps. As Marcus made his way down the narrow path, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if invisible eyes were trailing his every step. It was an unsettling sensation, but one he had long ago learned to push aside. He was determined to uncover the truth, to expose the mystery of St. Agnes to the light of day. When he finally arrived at the church, the sight of it sent a chill down his spine. It was as if the place had been forgotten by time itself. The windows were dark, the door hanging slightly ajar, as though the building was inviting him in. But it was not just the church's eerie silence that unnerved him, it was the feeling in the air. A palpable tension that seemed to hold the entire valley in its grasp. Despite the warning signs, Marcus pushed forward, stepping inside the decrepit structure with a mix of fear and fascination. The pews were broken, their wooden frames splintered and covered in a layer of dust, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. But it was the center of the church that caught his attention. There, towering above him, stood the oak tree, its roots sprawling like ancient tendrils, its branches twisting upward into the rafters as if they were searching for something. The tree was more than just a plant. It was an entity in and of itself, a living, breathing force that seemed to be the heart of the church. The sight of it sent a ripple of unease through his chest. He approached the altar, where the roots of the oak had broken through the floorboards, winding around the base as though anchoring it to the earth. It was there, under the cold, rotting floor, that he saw it, scratched into the wood, an inscription. The souls that pass this way belong to him forever. The words were faint, as though they had been written in a hurry, but their meaning struck him with the force of a hammer. His breath quickened as he traced the letters with his fingers, feeling an odd electric pull emanating from the floor beneath him. Before he could contemplate the message further, a sound broke the silence, the faintest whisper, like the rustling of leaves, but unmistakably human. It came from behind him, from the direction of the altar. Marcus spun around, his heart racing in his chest, but there was no one there. The room was empty, silent once more. The whisper had been a trick of his mind, he told himself. The church was old, and the wind often played strange tricks on the mind. But as he turned back toward the altar, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The oak tree, once still and lifeless, was now moving. Not in a natural way, but in a slow, deliberate fashion, as though it were alive, shifting, stretching. Its branches groaned with the weight of some unseen force, and as Marcus watched, horrified, the tree seemed to grow even taller, its limbs reaching toward the heavens, now grasping for something just out of reach. And then he heard it again. The whisper, only louder now, sharper and more insistent. "You shouldn't have come." Marcus stumbled backward, his feet tangling in the debris of the church's ruined floor. The whispers grew louder, now joined by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. His eyes widened in terror as he saw the shadows shift and swirl in the corners of the room, moving toward him with an unnatural speed. He turned and bolted toward the door, his legs trembling beneath him. The darkness behind him seemed to be gaining, the whispers closing in like a pack of wolves on a hunt. The church felt alive, alive in a way that shouldn't be possible, its walls closing in, its shadows growing thicker by the second. As he reached the threshold, a hand grabbed his wrist, a cold, clammy hand, impossibly cold and unmistakably real. He whirled around but saw nothing. Yet the pressure on his wrist remained, as though someone, or something, was pulling him back into the church. His pulse raced, and he fought against the invisible grip, using every ounce of strength he had to break free. With a final, desperate yank, Marcus pulled himself free and stumbled outside, gasping for breath. His heart was pounding in his chest, his vision blurred by the adrenaline. He didn't dare look back, but as he reached the edge of the clearing, a strange sound reached his ears, the sound of a branch snapping, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. A man's voice, low and growling, whispered from the church behind him, "You are marked now. No one leaves this place unscathed." Marcus ran faster, the words echoing in his mind. He had crossed a threshold, stepped into something he could never escape. And though he would leave St. Agnes behind, the church would never leave him. By the time Marcus returned to civilization, he was a different man, broken, haunted by what he had seen and heard. He tried to tell others of what had happened, but no one believed him. The town dismissed his story as the ravings of a man who had been lost in the wilderness too long, his mind damaged by the isolation. But Marcus knew the truth. St. Agnes was not just a church. It was a gateway, a dark place where the past, present, and future intertwined, where the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner than anywhere else on earth. He had seen it with his own eyes. The oak tree's roots stretched deep into the earth, pulling with them the souls of those who ventured too close. And now Marcus was one of them. He would never be free. And so the cycle continued. People came and people went, but St. Agnes stood, forever waiting, forever hungry. Its whispers, its promises, its horrors continued to call out to those who were foolish enough to seek it out. It had claimed more than just the souls of the living. It had claimed the very essence of the mountain itself. And the whispers were always there, always waiting for the next soul. Part 4. The Whispering Shadows of St. Agnes Church. Deep in the woods of Kentucky, nestled between towering trees and forgotten roads, the St. Agnes Church sat silently, like a tombstone for the souls it once held. The air around it felt dense, as if the very atmosphere was thick with an unsettling tension. Locals had long ago abandoned the once vibrant congregation. Now it was a relic, a shell of its former self, a place where shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. The church had been built in the early 1900s, a small, modest structure with stained glass windows depicting serene biblical scenes. But as years passed, something changed. No one knew exactly when, but one thing was clear. The darkness had begun to seep into its very foundation. It started subtly. The sound of faint whispers, at first indistinguishable, floated through the church's empty halls late at night. At first, people dismissed it. The wind, they said. But then, the whispers began to form words. They weren't the kind of words that gave comfort. They were angry, urgent, a voice lost in sorrow or madness. There was something deeply wrong within those walls, and soon, the townsfolk stopped visiting altogether. When Father James Connor had arrived in the 1950s, the church was already showing signs of wear, but he was eager to restore its former glory. What he didn't know was that the church had already begun to whisper secrets, dark secrets, that would consume him entirely. Father Connor, a man of unwavering faith, found himself drawn to a part of the church's history that no one spoke of. Hidden behind a false wall in the rectory was an old, dusty journal, bound in what looked like weathered leather. Its pages were fragile, yellowed with age, and its ink, scratched, faded, spoke of strange rituals, ancient rites, and blood sacrifices that had been performed on the very grounds that now served as a sanctuary. As he read, Father Connor's mind began to unravel. The words in the journal were written in a language that was unfamiliar to him, a script that seemed to squirm on the page, as if alive. The more he studied it, the more drawn he became, like a moth to a flame. Night after night, he locked himself in the rectory, poring over the journal, seeking the meaning of the cryptic symbols and incantations. But the whispers in the church grew louder. They began to echo through the halls, surrounding him like an unholy chorus, and Father Connor began to feel the presence of something otherworldly. His reflection in the church's grand mirror would distort, his own face shifting into something unnatural, as though the man staring back at him was not really him at all. His thoughts grew darker, and the light in his eyes dimmed. In the dead of night, Father Connor heard footsteps approaching the church, dragging against the floor like the weight of the earth itself. He would wake to see strange figures standing at the back of the pews, their eyes glinting in the dim moonlight filtering through the broken stained glass windows. Their faces were twisted with agony, and yet they seemed to smile in a way that chilled him to the core. He couldn't turn away. He felt compelled to step forward, compelled to reach out. Each step he took toward them felt like a descent into madness. His fingers would twitch, aching to touch the cold, hollow faces of the spirits. But when he reached out, they vanished, only to reappear somewhere else in the room. By now, the church was no longer a place of prayer. It had become a den of restless spirits, bound by rituals older than time itself. One night, when Father Connor stood before the altar, he heard the whispers clearly for the first time. They were not just words, they were orders. Join us. Become one with the void. The once peaceful altar had become an altar of sacrifice. Father Connor stood frozen, his body trembling as the church's ancient power enveloped him. His thoughts fragmented, slipping further into the darkness with each passing second. He could hear the voices of the lost souls, and in the distance, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the church, shaking the very foundation. On the night of the winter solstice, a terrible storm rolled in. The winds howled as the trees outside the church bowed to the pressure of the storm. Inside, Father Connor stood at the altar, holding the journal in his hands, his eyes wide and glassy, as if possessed. The storm outside mirrored the chaos within. As the clock struck midnight, the ground beneath him trembled. The walls of the church creaked and groaned as if they were alive. And then it happened. The earth shifted and the altar cracked open, revealing a dark, cavernous pit below. Father Connor stepped into the abyss, never to be seen again. The next morning, when the townsfolk arrived at the church, the doors were ajar and the storm had passed. But the church felt colder than ever. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. The stained glass windows, once vibrant and filled with light, now appeared cracked and shattered, as if something had passed through them, a force of immense power. Father Connor was never found. The church stood, desolate and forgotten. But some say that on certain nights, if you stand near the church's broken doors, you can still hear the whispers, soft and seductive, calling out to those who dare to listen. The voices are not those of angels. No, they belong to something darker, something far older, waiting for its next victim. As the years passed, people stopped visiting the church. Some claimed it was cursed. Others said it was haunted by the restless souls of the ones who had been sacrificed within its walls. But no one truly knew what had happened to Father Connor or the dark forces that had taken root within the church. Today, St. Agnes Church stands as a hollowed-out monument to something far more sinister than any human mind could comprehend. Only a few locals still whisper about the place, their voices trembling with fear as they recount the horrors that transpired within its walls. And so the church waits, waiting for the next soul to wander too close, waiting to drag them into the darkness that lies beneath. As the years wore on, the abandoned St. Agnes Church became a place that people in the nearby town dared not speak of. The whispers of what had transpired within its crumbling walls grew more frequent, yet no one dared to enter the church anymore. Not since Father Connor disappeared on that fateful solstice night. The once vibrant stained glass windows now stood broken, their once beautiful images of saints and angels shattered into jagged pieces of colored glass that reflected a cold, sickly light when the moon shone through them. It was as though the light itself was reluctant to enter. But there was a strange allure, a pull that would draw the bravest, or most foolish, toward the ruins of St. Agnes. For some, it was the mystery that tugged at them. For others, it was the possibility that the place still held power, dark and ancient, that no one could truly comprehend. One such fool was a young man named Greg. He had heard the stories, of course. The whispers that no one could quite understand, the disappearances, the strange happenings. He had grown up in the town and had heard the stories all his life, passed down like family heirlooms, but had always dismissed them as superstitions. Greg wasn't one to believe in ghosts or curses. To him, there was always a logical explanation. He had grown up with an unwavering belief in reason, in science, and in the understanding that anything supernatural could be debunked with enough research, enough skepticism. He was a student of anthropology, and his curiosity about the supernatural and its cultural significance led him to study various myths and legends surrounding the Appalachian region. But the stories of St. Agnes Church had always intrigued him more than the others. The church, with its mysterious disappearances, the rituals hinted at in old town records, and of course, the whispers that seemed to echo through the walls, Greg couldn't resist anymore. He had to see it for himself. So, one evening, Greg made his way through the dense woods, following the long-forgotten path that led to the church. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the night air was growing colder with each step. The forest around him seemed to grow unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves nowhere to be heard. It was as though the woods themselves held their breath, waiting. When he reached the church, a chill crawled up his spine. The structure loomed before him, twisted and broken, like a monstrous shadow stretching across the ground. The roof had collapsed in places, and the walls seemed to sag under their own weight. But the most unsettling feature was the silence. Not a sound reached his ears except for the faint thrum of his own heartbeat, which felt far too loud in the oppressive quiet. Greg stepped inside, the door creaking open as though the church itself were welcoming him. His flashlight beam cut through the dark, illuminating the rotting pews, the cracked wooden floors, and the eerie remnants of what had once been a sacred space. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. But there was something else, something faint but unmistakable. A faint, lingering scent of something, perhaps incense or something less identifiable, mingling with the dampness in the air. He wandered deeper into the church, his flashlight dancing over the old walls, which were now covered with creeping ivy and moss. But as his light touched the farthest corner of the sanctuary, he stopped dead in his tracks. There on the wall was something that made his blood run cold. It was a symbol, one that he recognized, though he had never seen it in such a context. It was ancient, its edges frayed and uneven but unmistakable. The symbol was drawn in what appeared to be a thick black substance that almost looked like old blood. The symbol was a perfect circle, with jagged lines running through it, almost as if someone had drawn it in haste. In the center was a strange, looping design, like a swirl, an endless loop that felt as if it could pull him in if he stared at it too long. Greg couldn't pull his eyes away. There was something hypnotic about it, something wrong. But then the whispers started. At first they were faint, so faint that Greg thought he had imagined them. He shook his head, chalking it up to his imagination running wild. But then they grew louder, clearer, voices, soft at first, murmuring in a language he couldn't understand. His breath hitched in his throat as he turned around, shining his flashlight in every corner of the church, searching for the source of the sound. There was no one there, just the empty pews and the decaying walls. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone were beckoning him. His heart raced, the flashlight shaking in his hand as he backed away from the symbol on the wall, his feet stumbling over the crumbling floorboards. And then, for the briefest moment, he thought he saw it. In the farthest corner of the church, where the shadows were thickest, something moved. It was quick, a flicker of movement too fast for his eyes to catch. A shape, no, a figure, emerged from the darkness. Its outline was indistinct, but there was something unsettlingly human about it, yet twisted in a way that made his stomach churn. Greg's heart slammed in his chest as he turned and bolted toward the exit, his feet stumbling over the debris on the floor. The whispers followed him, echoing in his ears as he raced out of the church and into the night. His breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the forest, not daring to look back, not daring to stop. When he finally reached his car, the door felt cold to the touch, as if it had been waiting for him to escape. He didn't even bother to start the engine right away. Instead, he sat there, his hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes wide with fear. The whispers still lingered in his mind, echoing in his ears long after he had driven away. And that night, as he lay in bed, he could still feel the weight of those eyes on him, the eyes of something ancient, something hungry, something that had been waiting for far too long. Days passed, but the experience at St. Agnes Church haunted Greg relentlessly. The whispers, the shadowy figure, the symbol, each time he closed his eyes, the memories came rushing back with a ferocity that shook him to his core. It was as if something had reached into him, wrapped its icy fingers around his soul, and refused to let go. He tried to shake it off. He tried to convince himself that it was just an overactive imagination. After all, people had been known to experience strange sensations in places like St. Agnes, abandoned churches with their eerie silence and long-forgotten histories. Maybe it was just the isolation, the solitude that had caused him to lose his grip on reality for a moment. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something dark had awakened in that church. Something that had been slumbering for decades, maybe centuries, waiting for the right person to stir it from its cursed sleep. And it had found him. The more he thought about it, the more it consumed him. He couldn't stop thinking about that symbol, the loop, the lines. There was something about it, something ancient and terrifying that his mind couldn't quite comprehend. Driven by an unbearable need to understand, Greg returned to the town's archives. He scoured old records, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what he had seen. For hours, he flipped through faded newspapers and yellowed pages, desperate to uncover the secrets hidden in the town's history. Then he found it, an old, crumbling letter tucked deep inside a leather-bound book. The handwriting was messy, frantic, as though the writer had been in a hurry to document their thoughts before it was too late. The letter spoke of a man named Father Joseph, the first priest of St. Agnes Church. He had been the one to establish the church in the early 1900s, but as the letter revealed, he was no ordinary priest. Father Joseph was part of a secret order that believed in rituals older than the church itself. Rituals that were said to tap into powers beyond human understanding, powers that allowed one to communicate with the spirits of the dead, and worse, to control them. The letter described how Father Joseph had begun experimenting with these rituals in the dead of night, performing unspeakable acts within the church's walls. But the more he delved into these ancient practices, the more he began to lose himself to the dark forces he was trying to control. The whispers, those same whispers Greg had heard, were said to be the voices of the spirits that Father Joseph had bound to the church. Their souls were trapped, tormented, twisted by his rituals. And it was said that they could only be released when someone worthy, someone with a pure soul, arrived to free them, or, in some cases, become one of them. Greg's hands trembled as he read the final words of the letter. The circle will be complete when the last soul is claimed. The one who hears the whispers will be the one to open the door. The letter was signed with a single name, Father Joseph. The realization hit Greg like a tidal wave. He was the one. He was the one who had heard the whispers. He had been drawn to St. Agnes Church not by chance but because someone, had been waiting for him. Panic clawed at Greg's chest as the full weight of the situation sank in. He had to return to the church. He had to find a way to stop whatever was about to happen before it was too late. But the thought of going back to that place, to the place where the shadows seemed to move on their own, where the air was thick with unseen eyes watching him, terrified him. Still, Greg knew that he had no choice. If he didn't go, the whispers would grow louder. The figure he had seen in the shadows would return and he would never escape. But if he did go back, there was a chance, just a sliver, that he could put an end to whatever dark force was calling to him. He steeled himself. He grabbed his flashlight, the same one he had used that night, and his notebook filled with all the details he had gathered over the last few days. He had to document everything. He had to be ready. As he drove toward St. Agnes Church that night, the air seemed to grow heavier. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him like an oppressive fog. He passed the familiar stretch of forest, the trees reaching their twisted branches toward the sky, as if beckoning him forward. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of leaves under his tires, the faint whistle of the wind through the trees. It felt as though the very woods were watching him, listening to his every move. When Greg finally reached the church, he hesitated. The building loomed before him, dark and foreboding, its windows empty and hollow. It was as though it was waiting for him to enter. The whispers, faint at first, grew louder the closer he got. They were calling to him, tugging at the edges of his mind. He stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to gather the courage to step inside. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his legs moved forward, almost against his will. The door creaked open and the cold air inside hit him like a wave. The church was the same as before. The pews were still arranged in a circle, the floorboards cracked and rotting beneath his feet. But something had changed. The whispers were no longer faint. They were sharp, insistent, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. The symbol on the wall was still there, glowing faintly in the darkness, its lines twisting as though alive. As Greg stepped farther into the church, the air grew colder, and the whispers seemed to wrap around him like a suffocating blanket. He could feel them, those eyes, watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it again. The figure, a dark silhouette standing in the shadowed corner of the church. This time it was clearer, more defined. The figure was tall, its features indistinct, but there was something unnatural about its presence. It wasn't human. Not anymore. Greg's breath hitched in his throat as the figure began to move. It was coming toward him, slowly, deliberately. The air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, and Greg could feel the pull, the compulsion to move closer. He had no choice. He had to confront it. He had to face whatever lay within the church's dark heart before it consumed him. As Greg moved closer to the figure, a sense of cold dread washed over him. It was like walking through a veil of pure, concentrated fear. Every step felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath him was pushing back against his will. The shadows seemed to deepen as the figure advanced, growing taller, darker, more menacing with each step. He could hear his own breath, ragged and sharp in the oppressive silence. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if they were coaxing him forward, urging him to come closer to the thing that stood before him. It was as though the walls of the church itself were closing in on him, tightening around his chest, making it harder to breathe. The figure stopped just a few feet away from him, and Greg's heart skipped a beat. It was impossibly tall now, towering over him, and its outline shifted and warped like a dark liquid in the dim light. The whispers had turned into voices, each one distinct yet layered on top of the other. Some were soft, others harsh, all carrying a weight of dread that seemed to press against his very soul. Greg's eyes locked onto the figure, and for a moment everything around him faded away. The church, the whispers, the fear, they all became a blur as his mind focused entirely on the figure in front of him. It was like he was being drawn into its gaze, pulled deeper into the abyss. "Who are you?" Greg whispered, his voice trembling. He barely recognized his own words. They seemed to come from someone else, someone who wasn't in control of his body anymore. He felt as though his will was being taken away from him, as though the shadows themselves were speaking through him. The figure's lips didn't move, but Greg heard the words in his mind, clear as day. "I am the keeper of the forgotten, the one who watches as the doors open." Greg's stomach twisted at the sound of those words. Keeper of the forgotten. What doors? What did it mean? Panic surged in him, but before he could speak, the figure extended one long, skeletal hand toward him. "Come," it said, and Greg felt the word pierce through his mind like a needle. His feet moved before he could stop them, his body obeying the command without his consent. It was as though the figure had control over him, pulling him closer and closer to the darkness. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to get away from this thing, but his body refused to listen. The floor beneath his feet felt as if it was shifting, the wood creaking and groaning as though it were alive, pushing him toward the figure. The whispers, the voices, they were deafening now, swirling around him like a storm. Greg stumbled forward, his heart pounding in his chest, but he couldn't stop himself. He reached the figure, and when he looked up, he saw nothing but blackness in its eyes, endless, consuming blackness that seemed to swallow everything around it. "Welcome," the figure whispered, its voice so low it sent a chill down Greg's spine. "You are the key." Greg's mind reeled. The key. What did that mean? He felt a sudden surge of terror like he had never experienced before. The air grew thicker, the walls of the church pressing in closer, the darkness swallowing him whole. He could feel himself slipping into something beyond fear, something darker than anything he had ever known. The whispers around him grew frantic, their urgency escalating as if they were closing in on him, trying to drag him deeper into the abyss. And then, before he could process it, he was no longer standing in the church. He was somewhere else, somewhere far darker, far colder. He could feel the weight of ancient eyes upon him, the sensation of being watched by something older than time itself. The air was thick with a malevolent presence, and the ground beneath his feet felt wrong, like he was standing on the edge of something ancient, something terrifying. Greg tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the unrelenting whispers. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think. It was as if he had entered a realm where time didn't exist, where reality itself was twisted into something he couldn't comprehend. Suddenly, a light flickered in the distance. A faint, dim light, flickering like a candle in the dark. Greg's instincts screamed at him to go toward it, to find a way out of the suffocating darkness. But as he moved, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all directions, echoing in his mind, in his very soul. "You cannot escape," they chanted, a chorus of voices that rattled his very being. "You are the key. You belong to us now." Greg's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled toward the light, his vision blurring, his mind slipping further and further into madness. He didn't know how much longer he could hold onto his sanity, but something in him refused to give up. He had to escape, he had to get out. With one final, desperate push, he reached the light and everything around him went black. Greg woke up with a start, gasping for breath, his heart racing. He was lying on the cold floor of St. Agnes Church, the beams of moonlight streaming through the broken roof above him. The whispers had stopped. The figure was gone, but the fear remained, gnawing at him like a festering wound. He sat up slowly, his mind reeling, his body trembling from the experience. He didn't know what had just happened. Had it been real? Was it just a hallucination brought on by the church's oppressive atmosphere? Or had he truly crossed into something otherworldly, something ancient and malevolent? The symbol on the floor was still there, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The pews were arranged in their strange, circular pattern, as if nothing had changed. But Greg knew better now. Something had changed. Something in him had shifted. And it wasn't just the church, it was the darkness that had followed him back from that other realm. His hand went to his pocket, and he felt the cold, smooth surface of the object he had found earlier. The strange medallion that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. He had no idea what it was, where it had come from, or why it felt like it was calling to him. But it was connected to all of this. The figure, the whispers, the door that had opened when he arrived. Greg stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him. He had to leave. He had to get out of St. Agnes Church before the darkness consumed him entirely. But as he turned to leave, the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. And this time, they weren't just in his mind. The cold wind howled through the trees, its mournful cry sending a shiver down Greg's spine. He stood in front of the old church, its once pristine white walls now faded and peeling, the wooden doors hanging loosely on their hinges as if pleading for release from the curse that had bound it. The shadows surrounding the building seemed to breathe with a life of their own, as though the very land around it was aware of his presence. It was as if the church itself had been waiting for him. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached out, his trembling hand hovering over the decaying door. The air smelled of damp earth and something far worse, decay, rot, and an ancient, fetid stench that seemed to seep from the ground itself. Greg stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry, cracked earth beneath him. It was a sound that echoed too loudly in the stillness, as if the very forest was holding its breath. As he pushed open the door, the hinges groaned in protest, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the entire church, as if it, too, had been woken from a long slumber. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of something burning lingered in the atmosphere. The pews, once orderly, were now arranged haphazardly in a circle, all facing the altar, which was no longer a place of prayer but a dark, twisted symbol of something much more sinister. Greg's breath hitched as he stepped inside. His eyes were drawn to the altar, where strange symbols had been etched into the stone, symbols he didn't recognize but that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. He couldn't help but feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The temperature had dropped, the air growing colder with each step he took. The whispers, faint at first, began again, soft and indistinct, like the murmur of voices just out of reach. The whispers were not in any language Greg recognized, but there was a distinct tone to them, low, guttural, almost pleading. It was as though the voices were calling to him, trying to pull him deeper into the church, into its dark heart. His legs felt heavy, his body reluctant to move further, yet his mind urged him onward. There was something here, something he needed to understand. As he approached the altar, the shadows seemed to shift and dance, forming shapes that lurked just at the edge of his vision. The walls themselves seemed to close in, the oppressive weight of the church's dark history bearing down on him. A sudden crash echoed through the air, and Greg whirled around, his heart nearly stopping. But nothing. There was only silence, broken only by the soft scratching of nails against stone. He looked down and froze. On the ground, just beneath the altar, something had been etched into the stone floor, a crude, jagged symbol that resembled a twisted version of a cross. But there was no mistaking it now. The symbol was moving. It writhed as though alive, pulsing with an energy that felt alien and wrong. Greg staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The voices grew louder now, surrounding him, crawling into his ears, into his very soul. His vision blurred as the whispers became words, dark and twisted. "You are here. You belong here," they seemed to say. The doors slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, trapping him inside the suffocating darkness. Greg's heart pounded against his ribs as he turned frantically, his mind reeling. There was no way out. The church had him now. And then from the shadows, a figure appeared. It was a woman, dressed in tattered, ancient robes, her face obscured by a veil of black hair that cascaded down over her features like a shroud. Her eyes, when they finally met his, were hollow, dark, and empty, a pit of darkness so deep it seemed to draw him in. The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, swirling around Greg, drowning him. "You should never have come here," the woman's voice whispered, her words seeping into his mind, slithering like worms through his thoughts. Greg stumbled backward, his breath ragged, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The woman raised her hand, and the symbols on the floor began to glow, an eerie, unholy light pulsing from them. The walls around him seemed to pulse with the rhythm, the air thick with malevolent energy. Greg's body tensed, the fear clawing at his chest, suffocating him. And then the woman spoke again, her voice now a low, seductive hiss. "The darkness is awake. It has always been awake. And now so are you." A sudden chill swept through the room, colder than any winter night, colder than anything Greg had ever felt. The temperature plummeted, the very air around him thickening, pressing in on him from all sides. The woman's form seemed to dissolve into the shadows, her presence now nothing more than a cold, oppressive force. Greg gasped for air, but it felt as though the very oxygen was being sucked from his lungs. His vision spun, the room around him warping, bending in on itself. The church, the altar, the whispers, everything was closing in, suffocating him. His body shook uncontrollably, his mind teetering on the brink of insanity. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whispers rose to a crescendo, their words becoming indistinguishable from the deafening sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. And then, in a moment of pure terror, Greg felt it, a cold, skeletal hand gripping his shoulder from behind. The last thing Greg saw was the darkness swallowing him whole. The last thing he heard was the whisper that would haunt him for the rest of his days. "Welcome to your eternity." And with that, the church went silent once more. Part 5. The Echoes of Dark Faith, Final Conclusions and Other. The church stood silent once more, the oppressive weight of its dark history lingering in the air like a suffocating blanket. The moonlight, which had once filtered through the broken roof, now seemed to withdraw, leaving the church in an impenetrable blackness. The only sound was the faint rustling of the leaves outside, whispering in a language that seemed to mock any attempt at escape. And within the darkness, the twisted altar glowed faintly, as if hungry for more souls to feed its eternal thirst. Inside, Greg's body lay still on the cold stone floor, his eyes wide open yet unseeing. He had been there for what felt like an eternity, the shadows that surrounded him thick and heavy, pressing against his very soul. His limbs ached, his chest tight as if something was choking the life from him. He had tried to scream, but no sound had left his mouth. The coldness had seeped into his bones, and no amount of movement could break the trance that had claimed him. The whispers, once distant and faint, had grown louder, now filling the entire church with their maddening rhythm. They swirled around him, growing closer with every passing moment. They no longer felt like voices from the outside world, but as though they were being whispered directly into his mind. He could feel them crawling through his thoughts, slithering into the deepest corners of his consciousness. Suddenly, the air shifted. A thick fog began to coil around him, its presence so heavy that it felt as if it had a physical form. The room, once so rigid and cold, seemed to expand and contract in a grotesque, undulating rhythm. The walls seemed to bend, as if they were alive, breathing. The altar, still eerily glowing with that unnatural light, now seemed to pulsate in sync with the whispers that had wrapped themselves around Greg's soul. Then, in the middle of the disorienting fog, a shape began to emerge. It was tall, its silhouette barely discernible in the haze. At first, Greg thought it was a shadow, a trick of the dim light. But no, this figure was real. Its form was human but distorted, elongated and too tall. As it moved forward, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the entity had awakened something inside them. The shape took slow, deliberate steps, its feet gliding just above the ground, leaving no trace behind. Greg's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to move, to react, but his body refused to obey. The terror gripped him so tightly that even the smallest action seemed impossible. And then, the figure stepped into the faint glow of the altar's light, revealing its face. It was hollow, an empty void where a face should have been. The eyes, if they could be called eyes, were just two dark, endless pits. But they weren't empty. No, they were filled with something far more terrifying. A profound, ancient knowledge that felt as if it had been buried beneath the earth for millennia, waiting to be unleashed. The figure's mouth opened, but no words came. Instead, a deep, guttural growl reverberated from its chest. It reached out toward Greg, its bony hand stretching impossibly long, its fingers clawed and jagged like the roots of a long-dead tree. Greg felt the air crackle as the figure's hand hovered above him, and an overwhelming force began to press down on him. His chest felt like it was being crushed, his lungs struggling to take in air. As the figure's hand descended, Greg could feel his very life being drained, as though the creature was feeding on his very essence. Every breath became harder, every heartbeat slower. The whispers rose in pitch, now an agonizing scream that rattled his mind. But just as the darkness threatened to consume him entirely, something shifted. A loud, deafening crack sounded from above. The roof, once a distant, decaying remnant, shuddered, and the ancient beams began to splinter. A torrent of moonlight broke through the cracks, filling the church with an unearthly glow. The whispers faltered, and the figure recoiled as if the light had burned it. For the briefest moment, Greg was free from its grasp, the pressure in his chest easing slightly. But the church wasn't done with him yet. The moment the light touched the floor, the walls began to writhe, as though the very foundations of the church had come alive. The ground trembled, and Greg's body was lifted from the floor, suspended by an invisible force. He could no longer tell if it was the church itself pulling him in, or if it was something far darker, something older than time itself. The world around him blurred, twisting and spiraling as the very space around him seemed to fold in on itself. He heard the sounds of the whispers, the figure, the screams, but everything was distorting, becoming a nightmare of noise and sensation. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The church returned to its eerie stillness, the whispers fading into the distance, and the figure's presence vanished into the shadows. The light from the moon faded, leaving only the pale glow from the altar, its sinister pull now quiet, waiting. Greg, now lying on the cold stone floor, tried to comprehend what had just happened. The terror still gripped his heart, the dread of what he had witnessed overwhelming his senses. He wasn't sure if the church had simply let him go, or if something else had intervened. But as he slowly regained his bearings, he realized one terrifying truth. He had not escaped. He had only become part of the church's endless cycle. The whispers, the figure, the shadows, it was all a part of something far darker, far older than he could understand. And now Greg had joined that cycle, his name now etched into the history of the church, waiting to torment the next unfortunate soul who wandered too close. Outside, the night remained quiet. The wind had stopped howling, the trees had fallen silent. The darkness was waiting for its next victim, and Greg could already hear the faintest whispers creeping through the cracked, decaying walls. As he lay there in the cold, his mind slipping into the black abyss, he understood. The church would never let him go, and now neither would the shadows that had claimed it. Final. The story we've just explored is one woven with fear, mystery, and the ever-present tension between the known and the unknown. From the moment Greg stepped into the church, his life became inextricably linked to the dark forces that had claimed it. The church, with its chilling whispers, eerie figures, and unsettling history, was no longer just a building of worship. It had morphed into a vessel for something much darker, something far more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. In many ways, Greg's story symbolizes the fragility of human existence when faced with ancient and incomprehensible forces. When Greg first entered the church, he was naive, unaware of the horrors that lay beneath the surface of this seemingly abandoned place. His curiosity drove him, and like many of us, he was compelled to understand something that should have remained a mystery. However, what Greg failed to realize was that some mysteries are not meant to be unraveled. Some places, haunted by centuries of forgotten rituals, are better left undisturbed. Greg's experience serves as a stark reminder of the power of our own curiosity, and how it can sometimes lead us down paths from which there is no return. There are places in this world that remain untouched for a reason, not because we lack the courage to explore them, but because they possess powers beyond our comprehension. The church, for example, was not merely abandoned. It was a place where darkness had gathered, festered, and transformed over decades. The shifting walls, the whispers, and the grotesque figure that appeared before Greg were all manifestations of something that had thrived in the shadows for centuries, something that had become a part of the land itself. Greg's struggle, as he tried to escape the grip of the church's evil, is relatable to many of us. How often do we find ourselves entangled in situations or relationships that we know are toxic, yet we continue to search for answers, hoping for resolution? The church in Greg's story is a metaphor for the dangers of becoming too deeply involved with forces we don't fully understand. It's tempting to want to uncover the truth, to shine a light on the unknown. But sometimes, the truth isn't something we can or should handle. Just as Greg's search for answers led him deeper into the clutches of the church, many of us find that our relentless pursuit of knowledge, power, or control over situations can lead us to places from which we may never return. Throughout his ordeal, Greg is forced to face the terrifying reality of the church's hold over him. The whispers, the dark figure, and the eerie moonlit altar, all of these elements symbolize the struggle between light and dark, reason and madness. At first, Greg was determined to overcome the darkness, but soon he realized that the church was not merely a place. It was an entity, a presence that could not be fought. It existed not just in the physical realm, but within the fabric of the world itself, binding Greg to its eternal cycle. His escape was never meant to happen because the church was built to consume and ensnare. But as the story reaches its unsettling conclusion, we are left with one final chilling truth. Greg, like many before him, has become part of the church's dark history. His name will be etched into its endless cycle, and his suffering will serve to feed the sinister force that lies beneath its foundation. The church will never let him go, just as darkness and despair will never fully release their grip on the human soul. In the end, Greg's story becomes a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers of exploring places we don't understand, of getting involved with forces we aren't prepared to face, and of pushing our curiosity too far. The lesson we can draw from Greg's harrowing experience is clear. There are some things in life that should remain shrouded in mystery. Curiosity can be a powerful force, but it must be tempered with wisdom. We must learn when to stop, when to walk away, and when to let go. The allure of the unknown is often tantalizing, but it can also be a trap. Greg's story teaches us the importance of knowing our limits and respecting the boundaries of the world around us. Not everything that seems enticing or mysterious is meant to be explored, and sometimes the truth we seek might be far too dangerous to uncover. But there's another important lesson embedded in this story. We all have the power to break free from the cycles that entrap us. Greg's story might have ended in the church, but we must remember that it doesn't have to be our fate. The church was able to bind him because of his fear, his uncertainty, and his inability to escape the mental hold it had on him. But in the real world, the key to breaking free from dark forces, whether they be toxic relationships, destructive habits, or negative thinking, is strength and resolve. By facing our fears, by walking away from the things that seek to consume us, we can reclaim our power. It's not always easy, and it's not always possible to escape unscathed. But the first step in breaking any cycle is to acknowledge its existence and then take the steps necessary to free ourselves. In Greg's case, he succumbed to the darkness. But in our own lives, we have the choice to resist. We have the ability to stop the cycle before it consumes us entirely. So, as you reflect on Greg's terrifying journey, Take a moment to think about your own life. Are there places you're venturing into that might be better left unexplored? Are there situations or relationships that, like the church, are holding you captive, draining you of your vitality? Now is the time to recognize the signs, to take action, and to regain control before it's too late. Your journey, unlike Greg's, doesn't have to end in darkness. You can choose to walk toward the light. And as always, if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more chilling tales, please consider subscribing to Whispers in the Dark. Your support helps keep the darkness alive, as we bring you more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about Greg's fate? What lessons can we learn from his tragic journey? Share your thoughts with us, and stay tuned for more unsettling stories that will haunt your dreams long after the lights go out.